Now then, good morning and welcome to the latest You Are My Boro with myself, Dom Shaw and Scott Wilson. We're live on YouTube, so thanks very much if you join us as we have a chinwag in the next half an hour or so. And thank you very much for your questions. We've had plenty coming in on YouTube and on Twitter over the last 24, 48 hours. We'll try and get through as many as we can. If we don't manage to get through some this time, we're going to do one of these once every couple of weeks throughout the summer. So we've made a note of them and we will come back to them. How are we doing, Scott? Before we start and get into the questions, we've had a mixed bag when it comes to predictions over the course of the season, I think it's fair to say. So what we say ahead of those championship playoff second legs, because poised, I think, is the word to use.
Yeah, I was chatting with a couple of mates about this last night, and I mean, obviously they're right in the balance after the first legs, aren't they? There'll be a couple of good watchers, I think. The first legs were very, very cagey, which obviously you sometimes get in kind of playoff games. Surely the second leg is going to have to open up a lot more than that. I think Leeds one in particular, Thursday night, could be an absolute cracker, especially if Norwich were to get a goal. I think that could be really interesting. I still think if you put a gun to my head that it'll be Leeds Southampton in the final. I know that West Brom and Norwich arguably have come in with even a little bit more form than Leeds and Southampton. I still think Leeds and Southampton will get over the line. So it wouldn't surprise me if at least one went all the way to penalties, mind, because I think it's set up like that. But I'll take Leeds and Southampton to still be playing each other in the final.
We were saying, weren't we, on the phone last night, if Norwich score first at Elland Road. And it's a funny one because you do think, don't you? I remember us having this conversation when we came away from Coventry last year. You automatically, kind of the natural assumption in a playoff game is 0-0 in the first leg suits the away team going back home, and yet we saw at Boro that doesn't necessarily play out that way. And I think because both Southampton and Leeds, there's the weight of expectation there. If they don't get themselves in front early, then that tension is just going to build, isn't it?
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? You know, Elland Road can be such a kind of boost for Leeds. We all know it's a cracking atmosphere and all of that. But like you say, if Leeds do find themselves behind at some stage, it can become so nervy. You know, I mean, we saw it with games towards the end of the season. Certainly the game I did there when Sunderland were there and it finished 0-0. It was so nervy at Elland Road. So I think that's a fascinating dynamic. And clearly that's what Norwich have to kind of play for. I still think Leeds will just about scramble over the line and make it to Wembley, but I do think it's going to be a good watch. What do you reckon?
Man, I don't know. It's the honest answer, but I realise that's not a great answer. I think if I had to pick, if I'm putting money down and I had to pick, I'd probably sway towards Leeds and Southampton. But I wouldn't be one bit surprised if it goes the other way. I mean, I know we're not here to talk about the EFL playoffs, but I'd have confidently predicted that it was going to be an MK Dons Doncaster League 2 playoff final, and they both got knocked out. The playoffs are bonkers, aren't they? It wouldn't surprise me one bit if either Leeds or Southampton got knocked out. There's no standout favourite to go up as things stand, is there? It promises to be a fascinating couple of weeks. But let's hold it there anyway, because we're here to talk about Boro, aren't we? Not who's going to be out of the league next year. We'll start with this one from Chris. As I said, thank you to all those who've asked questions, and do get them in live as we go here. Chris, do you think the job Carrick has done this season is better than last season? I'll let you start with this one, Scott. What do you reckon?
Yeah, I mean, I can see the rationale behind asking that question, because there's absolutely no doubt Boro have had far more obstacles to overcome this season than they did last season. So, you know, clearly, purely on paper, the answer is no, because they got in the playoffs last season, they didn't this season. It's undoubtedly true that they've had to overcome so much more this term. I mean, you know, there were periods in the season where pretty much the 11 players that Carrick had, he had to pick to start. And the way that he's come through those difficult periods is hugely commendable. But then I think you also do have to look back to the fact that when he came in last season, Boro were actually in a pretty parlous state, weren't they? You know, he inherited a side that didn't really look remotely capable of getting to the playoffs, and got them there. So I guess my answer would be I think there's very, very little between the two, because in season one, he inherited a side that was struggling, but struck on lucky with some inspired January signings that, yes, he would have had an input into, but were kind of presented to him and he made the most of. This time round, he had a lot more problems to overcome. The team was not as strong, and he got them to within 4 points of the playoffs. So it's not really an answer, is it? But in different ways, I think there's not an awful lot between them. I think he emerges with credit from both seasons.
I think the job he did last year is better when you consider where Boro were when they came in, when he came in, sorry, yeah. and just how good they were in the second half of the season. For the bulk of the second half of the season, they were at least the second best team in the championship, weren't they? Now, I know they didn't finish second, but there was that chunk of games when they won at Sheffield United, for example.
Yeah,
they were untouchable that night. But I think there's maybe more strings to Carrick's bow after this season. In that he's come through some really sticky spells. I think he's shown his tactical flexibility in going in changing for certain games. Leicester springs to mind, and how he's adapted to certain environments while still making it pretty clear that he will stick to his preferred way at every possible opportunity. And also having to adapt to losing such key players, and keep man management really, and keeping spirits high, because for all Carrick kept telling us early in the season, I have full faith in the squad, we're going to come through it. And what he said last week about after West Brom had backed us to finish in the top six, it's all right saying that, but the players are just human, aren't they? And doubts will undoubtedly start setting in as well there. So I think managing them as people as well, I think takes credit for this season.
It feels like a season that will stand him in very good stead if he is going to become a Premier League manager further down the line, doesn't it? Because, like you say, you know, there's been a lot of adversity this time, and the biggest kind of plus, I think, the biggest tick in the box, if you like, for Carrick, is the way that he did remain level-headed. He didn't panic. He didn't start making knee-jerk decisions that could arguably have made a difficult situation an awful lot worse. I do think that will stand him in good stead. But I also do take your point that, you know, he got them into the playoffs last season and very, very nearly got Boro up.
What about this one then? From Smog Kiwi, goalkeepers, he says, Dieng, Glover, Jones, Hemming, Bryn. What is your best guess as to what will happen? Surely Bryn Hemming must be worth a try by now. Few things on this. Jamie Jones, his contract expires this summer. Might be completely wrong on this. A safe bet would be that he was to move on. He wasn't named with Glover out, obviously having had the operation on his finger injury. Jones wasn't named on the bench for the final few games of the season. Teenager Conifere was. As you can just see from looking at those and what we're going to discuss here, Boro are well stocked in that area, potentially stronger than anywhere else on the pitch. So Jones came in as an extra experienced third choice last year after Hemming and Bryn had gone out on loan. I might be wrong, but I would expect him to go. Let's before we get on to Dieng and Glover, let's talk about Hemming and Bryn, because Bryn has come back from Leyton Orient, another hugely impressive season out on loan. He was impressed at Swindon the year before. I think he got, was it Players Player this season, or Fans Away Player of the season at Leyton Orient this season. And he still has, I think, a couple of years left on his contract. So he's clearly come back, and he's desperate to force his way into the team if possible. He's made clear in the past, he spoke to us last year and said his dream was to become Boro number one. Hemming, only this week has been in the news because he's had a hugely impressive season on loan at St Mirren. Their boss, Stephen Robinson, has said he'd love to get him back if possible this summer, but expects there to be a lot of transfer interest. He's 24, 2 years left. Both Hemming and Bryn are clearly huge talents. The problem they have at Boro is they've got Seny Dieng in the way, who has come in and had an impressive first season having joined Boro last summer from QPR, and Tom Glover, who's an Australian international. It's a tricky one, isn't it? I think it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out this summer.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you say, it's a strong position for Boro to be in. That you look at that list of options there, and there won't be too many Championship clubs with a deeper talent pool, certainly, than Boro have got. I mean, I think the starting point with a conversation about the keeper is going to be Dieng, isn't it? Because if Seny Dieng is still at Boro beyond the end of August, he will be the number one. I don't see any reason why he won't be. He's had a really good first season. He ticks all the boxes that Carrick wants from his goalkeeper in terms of being comfortable with the ball, distribution. He's also, at times this season, shown he's an excellent shot stopper. Now, there has been little bits of rumours around Dieng and the clubs from abroad. I don't massively see why Boro would want to sell him. But then, as I guess we're going to talk about with a number of transfers and a number of different players, Boro, as a Championship club without parachute payments, are kind of in the situation where if an acceptable offer comes in for anyone, as we kind of saw with the Morgan Rogers situation, it's going to have to be considered. So, if Boro were to get a reasonably big offer from abroad for Seny Dieng, I think it would have to be looked at. That said, I don't think that, they will not be actively looking to move him on. So I think if you work on the assumption that Dieng is still a Boro player next season, then he will be number one. I'm absolutely sure of that. The question then is Glover the number two, or does one of Hemming or Bryn dislodge him from that? That's an interesting one, because Glover obviously got the opportunity when Dieng had his injury absence around the turn of the year. Mixed, probably, is the best way to put it. There were some good performances in there, but there were also a couple of shaky ones. And, while Carrick stuck with him for a little bit while Dieng was getting his full fitness back, once Dieng was properly fully fit, he was back in the side. So I think there are questions there. Could Boro look to sell Glover and give a chance as a number two to either Hemming or Bryn? It's definitely possible. That said, though, if you're Hemming or if you're Bryn, you've probably got to a point in your career where being a number two and sitting on the bench all season and playing an odd cup game and waiting for Seny Dieng to get injured is not that appealing an option. So below Dieng, I think it is really interesting. I don't see at the moment Carrick deciding that Hemming or Bryn are going to be his number one from the start of next season. Do you?
No, I don't. But I think the beauty is, because they both have 2 years left. Bryn's 23, 2 years left, signed a new deal last summer. Hemming 24, 2 years left. What's the harm in them going out on loan again and moving up again? So Bryn was Swindon last year, League 2, impressed. Leyton Orient, League 1, impressed. Can he get a Championship loan club? Come back next year. Then he'd be coming, and the same with Hemming. If he was to go, and he's impressed at Kilmarnock, and then St Mirren. Clearly, there's going to be no shortage of interest in him. St Mirren look like they're going to be playing European football next season, or certainly in the early qualifying stages. Now, if they were to go out again and they come back next summer, clearly then with a year left on the deal, that feels kind of make or break. Then Hemming 25, Bryn 24. Then it feels like, well, if they're not going to be number ones here, they're going to go and establish themselves next year. But I think if there's a longer term vision for both, then I could completely understand the thinking in them going out for one more year. If they did that though, then Glover would have to stay, wouldn't he? Clearly, you need a trusted number two, and Glover, like Dieng, has been linked with a few clubs in the last couple of months. Kind of interesting, really. Where did that come from? Did it come from the Glover camp? The reason I say that is because it came out in the media in Australia, and it had the detail about him having the operation before that got out and was common knowledge over here. So that's interesting. Glover, Australian international, is he going to be happy to be sit and be deputy to number 2. He turned down the opportunity to join the Australia squad for the Asia Cup in the winter, didn't he? Because he was desperate to take his chance as number 1.
Yeah.
And like you say, I think he had an encouraging start there, but then disappointed really. And De Jong's return to the side felt a couple of weeks overdue by the time he came back in, didn't he? I think right now you'd expect De Jong to be number 1 next year, but there are some interesting decisions to be made there. We'll move on because we have got a fair bit to get through. Just one that's come through live on YouTube. Thanks to David for this. Are we happy being a profitable club in the Championship, or should we have long-term ambitions to be a sustainable club in the Premier League? Does it have to be one or the other? Is Boro's thinking that one leads to the other?
Yeah, I mean, I can see where kind of David's coming from, because there are a number of clubs within the Championship who have now been in the Championship for a number of years, big clubs, Premier League clubs in wait, and Boro would definitely count themselves amongst that group and in that list. And at what stage does that kind of dream of the Premier League and that ambition of getting in the Premier League become kind of so far down, so far out the picture that all of a sudden you are just a club ticking over in the Championship? I can see that argument. I mean, I think you've alluded to it there, Dom. You kind of got to be both, because there's no parachute payments now. Boro, that's those days are long gone. So Boro's only really chance of getting to the Premier League is to build year on year, improve, and get to a position where they can get themselves up there. Now, I would argue that only really happens by being a stable Championship club. And I mean, the thing is, Boro, let's be honest, Boro are not a profitable club in the Championship. They're overspending to try and get to the Premier League. You look at every account, every year the accounts show what Steve Gibson's effectively having to put in from his own pocket to keep Boro going. £1 million a month, roughly, there or thereabouts, over the last few seasons. So I don't buy the narrative that Boro are not having a go, if you like, and not trying to get to the Premier League. They're doing it without being reckless. And I think increasingly, we can see a number of Championship clubs have got themselves into trouble. I think now there's more of a sense amongst clubs in the Championship that the days of utterly reckless spending to try to get the Premier League seem to be diminishing a little bit, because it's caused so much damage to clubs in the past. So Boro are trying to do it sensibly, but that doesn't mean that they're not kind of spending above and beyond what they're actually bringing in, because they are. I don't think they can go an awful lot further down that line, if you like. Now, so what are they trying to do differently? Well, what they're trying to do differently is sign a different type of player who will actually give them a better opportunity of turning a profit. And maybe then there'll be more funds to reinvest. And we saw that with Rodgers, didn't we?
Well, let me just jump in here, because we've had another question from Jeffrey Wood, and it was, I'd like you to discuss Kieran Scott, the job he has done, and will do this summer. That ties in to what you're going to talk about there. So carry on.
Yeah. And so, Boro have tried in the last few years, haven't they, to effectively assemble a squad each season that they think will be good enough to win promotion. The problem that they've had is every season that it hasn't happened, that squad's then being dismantled, often with a change of manager or head coach. And there's just been a constant churn, and that hasn't helped anybody. Now, clearly what they're trying to do at the minute is adopt a bit more of a longer-term approach when it comes to recruitment. Kieran Scott is clearly the driving force behind that. Signing a different type of player. We've talked about this a lot on previous vids, isn't it? I'm not really telling anyone here things they don't already know, but younger players, more from abroad, bit more obscure, more of a development potential, more of a sell-on value. And the hope is that if you do that, you follow the kind of route that, Brighton and Brentford probably pioneered, where you do improve year on year. You're in that mix for the playoff places and the promotion mix 2, 3, 4 years in a row. And then eventually you get there and you get up to the Premier League. But you get up to the Premier League with a squad that you've improved year on year, that probably has young, desirable players in it that you can trade. And you're in a position where you haven't got yourself into so much financial debt that you can't try and have a bit of a go at it in the Premier League. That's the idea, I think. That's the big picture that Boro are trying to do. But they're clearly trying to do it in a way that doesn't get them into major financial difficulties while they're trying to do that.
And I think a couple of things on that. Key to making that work, whenever you talk about the Brentford and Brighton model, is an acceptance that because of your scouting and transfer success, the players who you're bringing in will likely, not all of them, but some of them will likely move on to bigger and better things. I think it's accepting that's the case and backing yourself to replace them in advance. So how many strikers have Brentford lost over the years? Yeah. How many players have Brighton lost? You look at Caicedo last summer as an example, that there are countless others who've moved on. Cucurella when he went to Chelsea. It's kind of that backing them. Well, I'm going to have someone else ready to step in. And you only have to look at the January transfer window. Finn Azaz was signed, not with Morgan Rogers' exit in mind, but with Boro looking ahead to the summer at that stage and thinking this is probably an area we're going to want to strengthen in the summer. They'd watched us as Bristol City were interested, other clubs were interested, and Boro kind of realised, well, we might have to move now. He was playing well for Plymouth. The chances are if they'd have held off and he'd have stayed at Plymouth, they wouldn't have got him for what they ended up getting him for in the summer. Now, as it turns out, Morgan Rogers moves on. Nobody could have seen that coming. Matt Crooks moves on. Now, clearly, Boro weren't completely prepared for those, but in bringing Azaz in, they've got someone there ready to step in. And although Azaz took time to get up to speed, I think we saw flashes of that at the back end of the season of why he was so impressive at Plymouth, and Boro will back him to really kick on next season. The other thing I think with Kieran Scott is everyone's pulling in the same direction. So I remember when we went over to Rockcliffe a couple of years ago, or whenever it was, and sat down with Kieran Scott, and it was early in Carrick's tenure, wasn't it? It might have been kind of Christmas time, 2022, or even after January. It was around that time, and Carrick was looking back and saying what was clear from the outside looking in when Wilder was in charge, certainly when Neil Warnock was in charge. You were coming at recruitment from two different directions. How many times have we talked about that Neil Warnock transfer window when you can tell who was a recruitment team signing and you can tell who was a Warnock signing? The same is said with Wilder. Now it feels like it's a Boro signing, doesn't it? Everyone's in there in the same direction. Now, that's not to say that everyone's going to agree on every player, but I think what they do agree on is the type of player they're trying to sign now.
Yeah, and I think so. A couple more things on that. I think, firstly, another big thing that Kieran Scott's done, and some of this has gone unseen, but in his time at Boro, he has overseen a pretty major overhaul of the way that recruitment works, the personnel within that, where Boro are scouting, how they're scouting, all of that. So there has been an awful lot of work gone into that, and I think we are starting to see the fruit of some of that. I think the challenge for Kieran Scott, probably, and the rest of the recruitment team as this evolves, if you like, is how do they start reinvesting money when they're bringing it in? Because thus far, they've kind of been operating to, a pretty strict budget. Now, they've sold Morgan Rogers. Okay, Morgan Rogers leaves for 10 million. Well, we know it's not a case that you get 10 million in your back pocket. You can spend that straight away. It's spread over the terms of the deal. There'll be clauses in there. Hopefully, there was one for Champions League qualification that kicked in nicely last night. But there will be clauses and everything in there. But having said that, if you sell another major player, I'm not saying this is going to happen this summer, but at some point over the next 12 to 18 months, there's a good chance Hayden Hackney might leave. There is a chance Rav van den Berg might leave. All of a sudden, if you've sold 2 or 3 players for £10 million plus each, how well do you reinvest that money? And I think that's because that then does give you an opportunity to start getting a squad together that actually is able to compete with the teams that are coming down with parachute payments. And Boro haven't quite got to that stage yet because Rodgers is really the first of the big sales under the kind of new regime, if you like. So it'll be interesting to see how well they can reinvest money if and when more players leave.
That links us to this one from Danny on Twitter. Thanks for this, Danny. Are we looking for a left-sided winger to mix it up, or a similar player to Mcgree and Rodgers? Well, clearly attacking midfield, those kind of forward areas, as well as a centre forward, which we'll get to, is an area that Boro want to strengthen this summer. Whether it'll be an out left-sided winger, when you look at the makeup of that forward line, Isaiah Jones and Marcus Forss are kind of out-and-out right-sided players. It's different on the left, isn't it? Mcgree plays off the left, but drifts inside. Greenwood did the same. Azaz did the same. Ramsey last year was probably more of an orthodox winger, but not just left. He could play anywhere across the forward line. So the honest answer is I don't know whether it is an out-and-out left-sided winger they're looking for. I think what's probably more likely is someone who's a bit more fluid, who can play across the forward line. What do you reckon?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, I think increasingly the days of a Stuart Downing style out-and-out left winger, get down the wing, get the ball back, get the ball into the middle, are largely dying out right across the game. I mean, I agree with you. Isaiah Jones really cannot. You would struggle to see him playing really anywhere else other than down the right-hand side. But pretty much every other player Boro brought in, Azaz, Greenwood, Mcgree obviously was inherited, but Mcgree would fall into that camp. Silvera, I think, largely as well, can really play anywhere across the front line. And I think that's the type of forward that Carrick likes, because it gives him options. You can have inverted wingers, you can have wingers, you can play 4-3-3, you could play wing backs, you can play 4-4-2 if you wanted to. So I think Carrick likes that type of forward. And increasingly, that's the type of forward that is just in the English game now, isn't it? You know, you look around the rest of the Championship and how many what you would really describe as out-and-out left or right wingers are there. I'd argue not that many. There's players who play as wingers, don't get me wrong, but they could just as easily play as a number 10 or even a number 9, most of the kind of that type of player in the Championship. So, Boro will be wanting a centre forward and an attacking midfielder this summer, without a shadow of a doubt. I don't think the attacking midfielder, or I'd be surprised if they were a out-and-out left winger. I think Carrick will want the type of versatile forward that he's pretty much signed ever since he's come through the door at Boro.
We've had several questions, so I'm not just going to put one about the midfield. Richard Box and Ben Evans are a couple who've asked about midfield and the type of midfielder Boro will go for this summer. Clearly, Boro are prioritising centre midfield. We've just had a story go up online before we started this video this morning that Boro's first 2 summer transfer priorities this summer will be completing the permanent deal of Luke Ayling. Sheffield United and Birmingham City are both interested there, and signing a midfield player. Now, Lewis O'Brien's gone back to Nottingham Forest and Boro have moved on there. They're not going to be looking to make that deal permanent. From what we gather, they're looking for a different type of midfielder. What type will it be? More box-to-box, maybe? Someone like Howson who can maybe offer that bit more protection. We touched on this last week, didn't we? How when you take Howson out the side, he's sorely missed because Boro don't really have anyone else like him. So will it be more of a box-to-box destroyer, protector type, do you think?
I think succession planning for Howson has to come into Boro's thinking this summer when they're looking at midfield. I mean, you know, how many times have we said it? Yeah, exactly. You know, at some stage, Johnny Howson's not going to be able to play every week. I'm not sure that's going to be next season necessarily, because at the minute he seems to be as fit as blooming ever. So, Howson will still be a massively important figure for Boro. But I do think that this season showed that when he left, Barlaser, O'Brien, who was in there, and Hackney, they're not the same type of midfielder, but a lot of their attributes are very similar. And so I just think that Boro lacked that bit of bite when Howson wasn't in the side. So I think if you're talking about Boro going for a centre forward, an attacking midfielder, and another midfielder, which I think is what we pretty much think will be on the wish list this summer, I think the other midfielder will be more of a. I'm not saying an out and out defensive midfielder in an exact house and mould, but I think it'll be a player who Carrick would feel more comfortable putting in if Howson wasn't around and in the side, to then be able to push a Hackney or a Barlaser 10 yards further up the field and allow them to become more creative.
Thanks to Joshy for this next one, and also the Duck Father, who asked a similar question on Twitter. Do we think the youngsters will play a bigger role next season, or is the sole goal just to win promotion? And Joshy on YouTube has said, which young players do you think will be next to establish themselves next season? I like Belongo personally. It's been a good season, really, for the young players. Law McCabe is clearly the standout. He broke through, regular in the team, has trained with the first team for most of the season, won, I think it was Academy Scholar of the Year, the category was called, at the recent club awards, and then made his first start on the final day against Watford. Boro have high hopes for McCabe, but there are several others who've been in around it. James Wilson made his debut on the final day, becoming the 999th first team Boro player. Charlie Lennon, AJ Matthews. There's various. We could go on. Finn Cartwright. There's various who've been in and around it next season. With McCabe, clearly the hope would be to kick on next season, as is always the case with these players, and the balance. It's the loan balance, isn't it? Which players are going to benefit from going out on loan and playing regularly? Which players aren't quite ready for that? So AJ Matthews, for example, is only 17. Is that too early for a loan move to go down to League One and League Two? Would McCabe benefit more from, at his age, just being in and around the first team squad on the bench? I think the one thing to bear in mind is that although clearly Carrick rates all these young players highly, that the case has been helped this year by the injury list and the fact that there has been opportunities opening up. The squad you'd expect to be deeper next season, so there might not be quite as many opportunities, but Carrick has shown with Hackney, with countless others, McCabe this year, if he likes you, if he thinks you're good enough, he'll give you a chance.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that will continue to be the case. I mean, I think that batch of players that you've talked about there are incredibly inexperienced, aren't they? I think
sorry to put in Sonny Finch is the other one, because Carrick really likes him, and he broke through at the back end of last season and was in the squad when Boro were going well. He had an injury, and that's disrupted most of his season next season. But Finch is an interesting one because Boro do have high hopes for him. Sorry, go on.
I think he's in a slightly different situation. So I'll come to Finch in a minute. I think all the other players that you've talked of, Belongo, McCabe, Wilson, that type of player, I think they're probably all candidates for loans in the first half of next season. If they don't go out on loan, they'll be in and around the first team group, but I think they'll be Carabao Cup players, potentially in a squad if there are injuries. The two that I think are different, one is in a very different position, clearly, and that's Alex Gilbert, because he is that bit more developed than any of them. I think that Gilbert's shown enough in the last month, and the little bits that you've heard Carrick talk about him, I think there's a decent chance he'll be challenging to be a regular first-team starter in the first half of next season. I think that's where Carrick wants him to be. Now, I'm not saying if everyone's fully fit and Boro bring in signings in the summer, which they will do, he's going to be able to get himself into the starting lineup. But I think he'll be part of that equation. Finch is an interesting one because, like you say, had he stayed fit all this season, would have been really interesting to see how far he could have come, especially given the fact that Boro didn't have a striker for a number of games this season. He is a bit more developed than that first batch of youngsters that we talked about. And I think next season will be quite a big one for him. Firstly, will he stay or will he go out on loan? Because what he hasn't had is a hugely, a really kind of game-changing loan in the way that Josh Coburn clearly had at Bristol Rovers. So will that happen? If that doesn't happen, will he genuinely be challenging for a first-team starting spot at Boro next season? That's going to be interesting to see because it feels like he's probably at a stage of his development where he maybe needs to be. So I think Finch will be interesting. I think Gilbert will be Part of that first team mix, definitely. I think the others, the likes of Mcgree, who have had chances at the end of this season, loans probably feel more likely for them, I think.
Pharrell Willis is the other one to mention, who was another
Yeah.
who Carrick played early in the win at Blackpool, very early in his tenure. Then he got a new contract. He told Dare of how he loved his positivity, but he also had an injury and came back and was in good form for the 21s at the back end of the season. Just to tie into that question from Matt, I suspect most of your questions will be about who comes in, but more importantly, which players do you think will be made available for sale over the summer? You've touched on Gilbert there. If we were having this conversation a month, 5 weeks ago, you'd have probably said, well, Gilbert looks nailed on to go out on loan. The promising cameos and performances at the back end of the season will have certainly given Carrick something to think about there. Mcgree, I mean, he's got a year left on his contract, is it? But hugely important player for Boro, and in an area that Boro already want to strengthen. You certainly don't want to lose a player like Riley Mcgree. Anthony Dijksteel is one where I don't think anyone would be surprised if he did move on. He's not part of, or he hasn't been part of Carrick's plans. He hasn't played much football. And when he has played, he's had some difficult times. The Rotherham game at the back end of last season came to mind when he gave away the penalty. And then that test in Leeds night when he was thrust in for, I think, his first game in 4 months and was up against Somerville, which is kind of like the ultimate championship challenge for a fullback, especially when you haven't been playing. Tommy Smith is expected to be fit again for pre-season. Luke Ayling, we've talked about, Boro want to bring in. Be no surprise, really, to see Dijksteel move on this summer, would it?
No, I think Dijksteel is one who it will be probably a surprise if he was still a Boro player come the start of September when the window closes. Carrick has had opportunities to play him far more than he has. And I think the fact that hasn't happened probably says that there's reservations there. I think Mcgree's an interesting one because...
I was going to come back to this. He has got a year left, so it's a new contract. Or
that's the thing. I feel like he's either got to sign a contract this summer or Boro would probably be willing to entertain offers, because what they don't want to do with Mcgree is get to a scenario where you're into January or the second half of the season and he's the next Paddy McNair and he's leaving for nothing, because he is a valuable asset, Mcgree. He's arguably the most valuable this summer that he's ever going to be. So I do think that it's either a contract or you're potentially listening to offers for him, because, I agree with you. He's a very important player, but I think Boro are a better team when he's in that side. But if you can't get a contract sorted this summer, then you're leaving yourself in a vulnerable position. And Boro have done that countless times in the past. But the new regime do seem to be very, very strong that they're not going to do that anymore. They're not going to get themselves into scenarios. Hence why they have been proactive in contracts for players. So, yeah, I think Mcgree's a watch this space one, because, I'm certainly not aware. And admittedly, the fact he's been injured probably means that Carrick hasn't really been asked about this as much as he maybe would have been if Mcgree had been in and around the team. But you might know differently. But I'm certainly not aware that contract discussions with Riley Mcgree are anywhere near a point where in the next couple of weeks we might be hearing something. Let's see. Boro have kept those kind of things under wraps pretty successfully in the recent past. But I'm not aware that a new contract is imminent for Mcgree. So if that's the case, then I think there will be questions to be asked there, maybe.
Sorry, I was just trying to find the quote, because we have asked Carrick about Mcgree's contract. I think it was after Isaiah Jones has signed his deal, and we asked him then about the kind of state of contracts and planning ahead. And he was asked. He was asked specifically on Mcgree, but as Carrick often does, gave kind of a general answer rather than going specifically on one player. But like you say, over the last couple of seasons, what Boro have done early is avoided any kind of any contract uncertainty. There was the McNair one this year, but McNair his exit was always inevitable, wasn't it? That was always a likely.
Yeah, and the fact that he was if not the one, pretty much the highest paid player, meant that it was always obvious Boro were not going to be offering that contract. Now, Mcgree, I would suspect they would be willing to offer what he's on at the minute, or even a slight increment. But I guess it's whether Mcgree and his agent think there's better deals out there further down the line.
Yeah, I mean, clearly early talks will have taken place, won't they? Because you don't get to this stage a year down the line, even though Mcgree's had a frustrating season on the sidelines. He's still a hugely important player for Boro, and Boro look a better team when he's fit and in the side, don't they? Watch this space on that one, as you say. I think we'll get clarity on it one way or the other in the next couple of months, won't we?
If we're talking about exits, I know there's a couple more that we're going to get to, but this isn't really talked about. I mean, Boro will not be making these players available for sale, but what about Hackney, Vandenberg this summer? Do you think, as you're sitting there now, both of those will still be Boro players come the closure of the window?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
Like clearly might be wrong with something like that. But I do at this stage now. So we'll start with Vandenberg. Yeah. Vandenberg did the interview in Holland recently where he talked about how he's happy at Boro. We've got a lineup this morning with Vandenberg where he says he's happy here. He knows he made the right decision last year. In Holland, in the interview in his homeland, he talked about how he's aware that he might have to progress in the future, but right now he's kind of Boro giving him everything that he'd hoped for when he signed. We spoke to him after the recent club awards, and he said similar then about how he's happy at the club. Now, clearly, regardless of how happy a player is, it's only so much in their hands, isn't it? If a mega offer comes in, I don't know, 15, 20 million pounds, then there's a decision for the club to make. It's the same with Hackney, isn't it? Now, at this stage, there's no indications that sort of bid will land, but we know Premier League clubs have watched Hackney in the past, obviously. Liverpool, Spurs, a few others have been, Newcastle have been linked in the past, haven't they? Hackney's had something of a frustrating season as well, but that might actually play in Boro's favour in terms of keeping hold of him this summer, hadn't it? Because if he'd have played every minute or barely missed a minute like he did last season, and I mean, first things first, would Boro have finished in the top six if you have a player of Hackney's quality playing every week? And if they do finish in the top six and Hackney impresses again, then England under 21 international, there's every chance then that a club might make a move. Might they wait until January or one more year? Is Hackney better placed waiting one more year? You can never say never. But I think Boro are in a position of strength with both.
Oh, Boro are in a position of strength with both. There's no doubt about that. If either of those players leave, it will be for absolute top dollar. I think the likelier to leave would be Hackney, and that's only because there's been interest in and around him from big Premier League clubs for 12 months or so now. There was a lot of talk in January was something going to happen, and it kind of died away. And, while this, it's not a case of give us 6 more months, then we'll listen to it. I do think to a degree it kind of died away because Hackney and his camp thought, well, look, it's not a great time to be moving in January. A lot of upheaval. Let's see what happens in the summer and where the land lies. Now, as you say, he's barely kicked a ball since then. If you're a Premier League club who have been really interested in him, I don't think the fact that he's been injured for 3 or 4 months makes the slightest bit of difference, really. You think you know what he's going to be able to give you. It's a question of whether any of them are actually going to make that move this summer. I think it's a really interesting one.
What do you think then? You put it to me. What do you think starting next season, end of the transfer window, will Vandenberg?
I think Vandenberg will still be a Boro player. I wouldn't be as confident with Hackney. I think Hackney might be the one.
This leads on to this one then, Latte Lath, the situation regarding Latte Lath's agent. What is this right offer and will Boro let him go? Can they afford to? If you haven't seen, Latte Lath's agent, Matthias Veneroso, did an interview in Italy earlier this week, which is more commonplace, first of all, in Europe than it is in the UK, isn't it? When we don't really hear from agents. And he was asked various questions about Latte Lath's future. Just to run through some of the quotes, if you haven't seen them already. he was asked about whether he's Premier League ready. If I have to look, or whether he can play in the Premier League, if I have to look at it from the point of view of maturation and what he has done this year, I can tell you that he's ready. We'll have to make the appropriate evaluations, bearing in mind that he has a contract with Middlesbrough where he's aiming to do a top-level championship and trying to win the league. Having a look around is not our first objective, but we know strikers are rare commodities and anything can happen. He was then asked about his valuation. I can't tell you the value. The English market is different from all others. It's certainly a high value. I imagine at least triple what was paid. The club will decide it in the face of any requests. And finally, he went on to say he's doing well at Middlesbrough. The club loves him and he has a contract. We have to understand what will happen because being a striker, we know that some offers will arrive, but they will have to be carefully evaluated. Hearing from an agent always spooks fans, I think, understandably, when there's a player in demand like that. But I actually think what he's saying is pretty balanced. What he's saying is we're not going to be touting him about. Now, what you could say is the fact he's talking is that in itself enough to be touting him about. But this clearly doesn't have the look of a player who's going to be fidgeting to leave this summer. He talks about how he loves Boro. Latte Lath told about feels he has a connection with the fans when he spoke to BBC Tees after the game. But what he does say is you can never say never. What's your feel on the Latte Lath situation in general?
I think there's a couple of things. I think that's really just an agent doing his job, isn't it? And like you say, it's much more common on the continent for agents to be kind of actively touting their players around in that fashion, in a way that British agents are much more circumspect to do. I don't think it's anything that should set alarm bells ringing. Whether we like it or not, to a certain extent, Latte Lath's agent wouldn't be doing his job if he wasn't talking up his player and saying he's ready to do this, that, and the other. So I don't think that's a massive worry. I think the thing with Latte Lath is he had an absolutely fantastic end to the season. But strip it away, and really, he's had 2 very, very good months in a season where he's shown promise at various other points, but has had injury problems, has also had periods where Carrick wasn't picking him and was picking Josh Coburn instead. And prior to coming to Boro, he's had really one good loan move away from Atalanta at St. Gallen in the Swiss League. Is that a body of work that's going to have Premier League clubs banging the door down to sign Emmanuel Latte Lath for 15 million quid this summer, 20 million, whatever? I don't think so. I think he's going to have to do it for longer. Now, if he plays for the whole of the first half of next season in the way that he's finished the last 2 months of this season, we're having a different conversation then, I think. But at the moment, I think it's unlikely that Latte Lath is going to attract the kind of offers that would make Boro have to seriously think about what they were doing with him.
I was going to say that what's a certainty is Premier League clubs abroad will now be watching him, will now be aware, even just on that 2-month body of work. But like you said, the more likely a prospect is they spend the first half of next season watching him. Can he kick on? Then you're having a different scenario in January, potentially, when if he continues his form and is, say, top of the championship goal chart, and you've got a struggling Premier League side who need a centre forward to help them get to safety, well, then there's a different conversation. I agree with you. I think there are too many questions if you're a buying club, aren't there? Or too many unknowns at this stage.
Yeah, and I mean, if you're a lower end Premier League club, I just wonder if, to a certain extent, you're questioning whether you've missed the boat with Latte Lath a little bit. We talk about the job that Kieran Scott and Boro's recruitment team have done. Well, Latte Lath is starting to look like an absolutely massive tick in the box for them, because, if you're a Brentford or a Brighton, your modus operandi is signing Latte Lath at the point when Boro signed him. It's not going and paying 20 million quid to get him out of Boro, generally, is it? I might be wrong. And
the same can be said of Vandenberg. The same can be said of Rodgers.
Yeah. And there are clubs on the continent who might want to do that. Now, I know you'll say, well, Villa went, but Villa are a little bit different in that up until now, they've tended to sign the finished product a bit more. They're not like Brighton and Brentford, where they're recruiting players you've never heard of from, you know, South America, Europe, wherever. Largely, clearly there are some where they've done that, but in general, so yeah, I think to round it off, I think massive tick in the box so far for Boro in terms of what Latte Lath's done. But I think it's still at a fairly early stage of his development and him showing what he's actually capable of. And I'd be surprised if Boro were fielding the kind of offers for him this summer that, like I say, would make them think, can we really afford to turn this down? I don't think that'll happen.
Let's wrap up there. 50 minutes is more than enough, I think. Thank you if you've sat and watched us non-stop.
You deserve a medal.
Yeah. We are going to do a couple of these. Sorry, one of these every couple of weeks. So keep getting your questions in. Apologies if we haven't got to them, because there are a fair few we haven't got to. But we've made a note of those, and we'll come back to them. Especially, obviously, if the situation's unchanged next time we do it in the next couple of weeks. Do subscribe to the channel if you aren't already, and rate and review if you listen to us on podcast. This, as always, will be available on podcast. We'll sort that now, so that'll be available straight away. And obviously, if you haven't been able to watch us all live, you can catch up on the YouTube channel. That video's there, as always. Thanks for watching. Thanks for your questions and your participation. And we'll be back at the start of next week with our next You Are My Boro.